Cool.
We're rolling.
Speed. And all right. First of all, do you go by? Do call you Doctor Barron, or how do you prefer to be addressed? Is there a title?
It really doesn't matter. Doctor, professor, those are the titles I have. Just Frank would be fine too.
Just Frank would be fine. Okay. I was just kind of curious. I mean, what was your first introduction to Albert Bloch? How did you?
Well, I really didn't know about Albert Bloch before 1987, and we have regularly visiting professors from Germany, and a professor came from the city of Münster, University of Münster, and he asked me, as I got to know him during his stay here, about Albert Bloch, and I couldn't really tell him anything, but I consulted colleagues, and that was a way to find out who Anna Bloch was and that she was still living here. But it's interesting that came about because this professor had a specialty in about working on an Austrian writer named Karl Kraus, and he knew about Albert Bloch, the fact that Bloch had corresponded with a journal that Karl Kraus published in Austria, and so he was well acquainted with who Bloch was, not as an artist, but as a literary person. Somebody who's interested in issues that Karl Kraus was raising in Vienna. And so that was his interest. And so we went to visit Mrs. Bloch, and it was a kind of an amazing encounter in the sense that we learned so much about something we didn't know about. He knew about this one aspect of Bloch's life, but did not know about his artistic side. So that was a totally new thing for him. And so he was very excited about, being able to visit Mrs. Bloch and talking with her and learning about her. And of course, I was kind of on the sidelines, but as his interests evolved and his findings, then he told me about them, and out of this, these conversations, and the fact that Mrs. Bloch was so open in talking about her husband and his work, we began to collaborate on helping to bring Bloch into the foreground again, to kind of rediscover him. That was our intention.
And I would say that you've been successful at that.
Well, we were able to organize a conference in 1992, and that was a way of bringing together people we knew about who were somehow interested in Bloch and who'd done some work on him, and others, and that took place here in Lawrence, Kansas. And it so happened that one representative of the museum from Kansas City happened to come and then investigated the chance of having an exhibit in Kansas City and in Munich. So that really was part of a kind of an evolution from that beginning in Lawrence here.
What has been your what has been your sense and your reaction to Bloch?
would interest me and what
Yeah, what was it about Bloch that drew you in?
yeah. Well, for me, who is in the field of literature primarily, it was just fascinating to see this interdisciplinary nature of Bloch's life. I mean, he was primarily an artist, but as an artist, he was closely working as a young man with this newspaper in St. Louis, and gradually got very much involved in writing as well as drawing and artwork. So, I mean, for me, this was really a chance to kind of make use of my interest in literature to get involved in something new, and I organized a couple of dissertations about Albert Bloch. So those things resulted out of topics that were mainly in literature, but then also kind of reached over into these other areas. So art and literature. This interplay is of course very interesting. It's nothing new in German culture. Goethe, for example, was also an artist, and there are others. And especially at this time, and maybe we can talk about this, 1911, 1912, it's really a time of a breakthrough in many areas, and art and literature are often combined in these new developments.
Well, I mean, you talk about it was a very interesting time for this development in art and literature. I mean, it was Bloch left St. Louis to go to Europe. I believe it was around, was it 1911, wasn't it?
No, he left 1908. I think he arrived in 1909 in Munich, and so he was there from 1909 to 1919, pretty much the entire time. So 10 years he lived in Munich.
Would you have any sort of impression, or could you set up kind of for the scene for me, just a little bit about what Munich would be like at this time?
Yeah. Well, I think maybe it was one of the high points in Munich's cultural life, the turn of the century. There were many artists and writers. My special interest is Thomas Mann. Thomas Mann moved to Munich around 1900, and some of his writings at this time have to do with Munich. It's a very interesting time. Munich, and I suppose you could just look at it from this point of view. There are these coffee houses, and these writers, artists congregated there and met each other, discussed politics, discussed art, discussed literature. And I mean, it's not just Munich residents. These were Russians, Frenchmen, Italians, kind of converging in these coffee houses. And Bloch came into this atmosphere, and for him it must have been fascinating, having had a strong German background. He was able to adapt and speak German, probably very fluently immediately. And I mean, one way that you can see the atmosphere is by his caricatures. He made caricatures of writers and artists, musicians, in these coffee houses, and that was published. And I think that gives you a sense of how he saw this time. And he went to concerts. He was very much interested in music too. So it's literature, art, music, I mean painting and music, all these things are combining. And you can see it also in these links. For example, Schoenberg was one of the, was a composer basically, but he was also an artist at the same time. And he was part of the first Blue Rider group. So, a lot of things converged to make it a very exciting time.
Well, do you think it was unique that I guess maybe it was he coming from a German-speaking home, having immigrant parents, that made it easy for him as an American to sort of adapt and sort of move into this group? Or was there something uniquely about him other than that, aside from that, but I guess did that background make him unique as an American in some way to sort of be able to kind of blend into this culture, or was it just the setting at the time that they were looking for influences from everywhere?
It's probably there are different things operating, but from his point of view, I think it's easy to understand that he would like to be in Munich. The most obvious place for an artist was actually Paris, and he did go to Paris, but then decided that Munich was for him after all the place. It probably had to do with what you suggested. He's coming from a background with this language preparation, cultural ideas and so forth, and it was kind of natural to feel at home in a place like Munich.
Maybe kind of what I'm getting at. Is
Yeah.
there something that he contributed that was still American about? Was there something uniquely American about?
What he had to offer.
Yes.
Well, I think so. I don't know about the American aspect so much. He had been doing these caricatures for the Daily Mirror, the St. Louis Mirror, and then also the St. Louis Post from the beginning. And so he had a lot of experience in observing American culture and commenting on it. And coming with that background, he could offer something different. And I think that those people who were kind of key figures in the Blue Rider, Kandinsky and Mark, they recognized the uniqueness of what he had to offer. And they were very much interested in the international approach to art.
Well, bearing that in mind, can you tell us, do you know much about, how Bloch's introduction, there was the NKVM.
Okay.
Do you know anything more about Bloch, anything about Bloch's introduction to that particular group?
Okay. Well, that's a very interesting development, and I spent a lot of my own research on that topic because I realized that there is a difference between what Bloch himself said about that story, which has to do essentially with how the Blue Rider was born, how it came about, how it took place. It was an exhibition of the Blue Rider, and that made art history. So the background to that is seen in different ways, but not necessarily the way Bloch saw it. Bloch gave a lecture in Denver about that. But what he says is not what is in the art history books. And that interested me. Why is Bloch's perspective not really taken account of? He said that he had something to do with the breakup of this society of artists in Munich. and that led to the to this exhibit of the Blue Rider, and that I mean that is what I think is very interesting, and I've spent time researching it, and I think I found some documents to support what Bloch was saying.
Well, I mean, he was initially rejected from that particular group, wasn't he? The NKVM?
Yes. Rejected it. He had been encouraged to become a member by Kandinsky and Mark. Kandinsky visited his studio, and you've probably seen pictures of that studio. They show some of the paintings that were exhibited in the Blue Rider, and it's a kind of a fascinating photograph of him sitting on his bed, and the pictures all around on the walls. Kandinsky was impressed and wanted him to become part of this group that was about to exhibit, and he was not accepted. There were people who came and were friendly. They looked at his artwork, and then the result was that he was not asked to join this group. And of course, Kandinsky and Mark were very much upset about that. And this occurrence is, I mean, I could go into the reasons for this, and then how things evolved. What eventually happened was that there was a big meeting, and Kandinsky and Mark dramatically left and abandoned this organization, this society. And that dramatic exit is usually what is described in literary histories. It seemed to be mainly a dispute on the size of Kandinsky's painting. I mean, they did not like Kandinsky's very radical approach to art. But what is overlooked is that they had, Kandinsky and Mark and Bloch had already been discussing another exhibit even before that. And that was really in reaction to the way they treated Bloch. In other words, about a month or two before the dramatic breakup, they were already pretty much certain this is the only way they can go. And this had to do with a kind of a conservative camp in that group, which seemed to be in the majority, which wanted to have a local representation, Munich artists. The previous exhibit was very much criticized by the Munich press. And so these conservative elements, and it was not just in Munich, it was really throughout Germany that there was a defensive reaction to the influence of Paris and, of course, Kandinsky coming from Russia. So there were two camps, essentially the international group and the local, provincial, conservative group. And Kandinsky and Mark decided this is not the way to go. And so they went off into this Blue Rider direction, which, of course, was also Bloch's direction. So they formed really an international group, American, had a kind of a representation in that.
I mean, Bloch, okay, let's talk about that first Blue Rider exhibition then. I mean, Bloch he had like 6 paintings in that first exhibition. Is this, I'm sorry, there's a squeak going on back here.
Is that me?
Yeah.
Can you hear that, Kevin?
Yeah, he only does it between shots.
Only at perfect moments.
Only at perfect moments, yeah.
Yeah.
We need to.
No, I'll pull the monitor closer so I don't squeak anymore.
Okay.
There we go. No more squeak.
Okay, I'm sorry. We were gonna talk about that, we were talking about that, first Blue Rider exhibition. And, I'm still hearing it. Can you cut and just swap out that chair?
Yeah. Nolan?
Okay, control and speed and all of that. All right, we were talking about the first Blue Rider exhibition. I mean, Block had 6 paintings in that first exhibit. I mean, one could consider this like a really, really large number of paintings for, someone's first exhibit. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, it's something that stands out when you consider that Kandinsky and Mark had fewer paintings in the exhibit. Gabriele Münter, who's very much admired today, also had 6. So in that sense, he was not alone. And I don't know if the number is very significant, but at least it shows a certain respect for Bloch's contribution. I mean, they must have thought that he had something important to contribute. And it's also, I suppose, an effort to reflect the variety of in his work. So I think it's really a positive contribution that he made, and for which I think he has a right to be recognized.
And then there was, of course, a series of exhibitions, but I'm kind of curious. I mean, how the onset of World War I affected the Blue Rider.
Okay. Well, of course, you know that 1914 in Germany was a year when most Germans were enthusiastically kind of jumping at the chance of somehow solving the problems, the international political problems, by going to war. There was an enthusiasm that somehow evolved out of these political tensions and frustrations. So Franz Marc and many others were volunteering for the war. And there was a comment by Bloch that if he had been able, he would have joined also, talking in retrospect. I mean, that was the feeling in those days. So it was a great enthusiasm, and there were kind of hopes that it would lead to something positive. It didn't take long.
Why was he not able to join? Because he was an American?
Yes. I think he was there with his family, and he was intending to go back to America. But there is a correspondence between Mark and Kandinsky, and of course you can imagine that Kandinsky, as a Russian, would not share that kind of feeling, and it was clear very quickly that it was impossible to keep the group together. Mark had died in 1914 already. Franz Marc was a soldier and died in 1916.
This was in France, wasn't it?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Well, what happened? I mean, could you say that the political situation and the onset of the war? I mean, is this the reason? Like maybe 2 exhibitions of Bloch's work. There was one at there were 2 that were prevented. I mean, is this the reason? Was the onset of the war?
I don't believe. I mean, this is speculation on my part. It's hard to reconstruct those situations. You can argue just as strongly for efforts and successful efforts for exhibiting Bloch's works in 1914 as well as 15, 16, 17, 18. He continued to exhibit throughout the war. There was no effort to somehow prevent that. Mark helped him make contacts, and he made an important one in Berlin. And throughout the war, this gallery, Sturm, was like an agent for Bloch's works, and his works continued to be exhibited. In 1916, he exhibited together with Paul Klee. So he had significant exhibits, and then 1918, he began an association that with Goltz, that was a gallery in Munich, and there was a very important exhibit of Bloch's works, over 100 paintings in Munich. So he had a certain degree of success in exhibiting.
What happened to the rest of the Blue Rider at this period of time?
Well, of course, quite a few of them were French and Russian, so they left. So Paul Klee had joined a second exhibit, and he was for a while in Munich, but then he went to Switzerland also. So there was no coherence anymore. There was no way of keeping these artists together.
Mark returned to military service. I mean, Kandinsky returns to Russia. Okay, we covered that. And we talked to that. Franz Marc was killed in 1916. How did the? What would you know about Mark's death and how that affected and impacted Bloch?
Franz Marc was very interested in Bloch's work, and this interest evolved into a friendship. Bloch visited Marc many times. This is very early, in 1912, 1913, 1914. Marc supported Bloch, and you can see this in a correspondence between the two. And the correspondence continued into the First World War. And Bloch knew what difficult situation Marc was going through in the war. That is, Marc, who was enthusiastic at the beginning, was seeing by 1915 that it was not going to be a quick war and was becoming quite frustrated.
I'm sorry.
Okay, so